Hello, welcome to APUSH, the DBQ, predictions and guesses. Yes, I do tend to try to make some sort of a prediction or a guess as to what a DBQ or maybe even the FRQ might be, some things you can focus on while studying for the test. Sometimes I'm close, sometimes I'm really far apart, so disclaimer here, don't blame me for anything I may or may not get right or wrong. All right, so let's go on. First of all, think about time periods whenever they're going to start giving you these essays, and think about what's already happened. So the colonial period, and let's say 1607 to 1750, what have they already done? Well, in 2010, there was already a DBQ on Puritans, so we can all breathe a sigh of relief. We won't have to write a DBQ about Puritans. But there could be an FRQ. So just be aware of that. You should know about Puritans because there could always be an FRQ. In 2004, the French Indian War, specifically how did it alter relations with Great Britain and the Americans, 1740, 1766. And in 1999, there was a American identity on the eve of revolution, almost the same kind of a DBQ as the 2004 one. So what could they still cover in this time period? Well, if they wanted to go back to early colonial like they did with the Puritans, perhaps they could cover English native Indian relationships, 1607, 1675. This would be your Anglo-Powhatan Wars, Pocahontas and her marriage to John Rolfe, the beginning of reservations after they won Lord De La Warr coming over here with the Irish tactics as he fought the Powhatan Indians. That's all in Virginia. If I go up to Massachusetts, you've got the Pequot Massacre, the Pequot Wars, that's 1635, 1636, the massacre along the Mystic River, the beginning of genocide happens with that particular event in Connecticut along the Mystic River. A little bit later in the 1670s, 1675, 1676 in Massachusetts area again, you've got King Philip's War, where the Indians try to unite to try to push the English out. They do wind up destroying several towns and villages. It's one of the highest death rates in all of American history for that particular war. Chief Metacomb is King Philip. Remember that war, the King Philip's War, is fought basically by the descendants of the Mayflower. So those are some points that they could perhaps cover and something like that. The First Great Awakening has never actually been a DBQ, at least not in the last 20 years or so. 1730 to 1740s, it might ask you about changes in society, what was going on during this time period. It might take in a little bit more than just the Great Awakening. You had the Peter Zenger trial took place right around the same time. Remember, that's the beginning of free speech, the Peter Zenger trial. You have Cotton Mather's letter on inoculation took place in 1724. So there's some things here that maybe you could talk about with changing society. And just remember the Great Awakening. That was a time period of religious revivalism. You had the old lights versus the new lights, more emotionalism with the new lights. The Holy Spirit takes on a whole new role. This is also the beginning of an egalitarian movement, equality. Women were getting involved, the feminization of the church. You had itinerant preachers, traveling preachers, and some of which were African slaves and even Indians, so part of the egalitarian movement as well. Questioning authority also comes during this time period. What about the revolution through nation building, 1776 to 1824? Well, they've had quite a few DBQs on this. In 2005, the American Revolution, how it changed society. In 2009, they had African Americans looking at free men and women who were living during this time period, 1775, 1830, and slaves. And they asked basically, well, why was the two different groups at the same time? And to give some explanation of that. Then last year, 2013, growing opposition to slavery, basically the same time period. This was your abolition movement, the various compromises that came around during this time period. In 2006, there was the Republican Motherhood, Cult of Domesticity, horrible, nasty, confusing. We don't like to talk about this one a lot. But it was about women during this time period and their changing roles. Well, what's left to cover? There could be a lot of things perhaps left to cover, but two things that come into my mind. You've got the election of 1800, what Jefferson called the Second Revolution. This is the election, the second election between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. The Federalist, John Adams, and the Jeffersonian Republican, and Thomas. You could look at political changes. This was the end of Federalist rule. They had 12 years in power. Perhaps this is a political type essay that they might throw at you. That could be a possibility. And you'd have to think about what were the Federalists doing here at the end. Alien Sedition Acts, their quasi-war with France. This led to Jefferson and his compact theory and Virginia-Kentucky resolutions. He eventually wins this election, and he's going to bring about the new revolution of 1776, or reinvent it again. Strict constructionism versus loose constructionism. I mean, there's some good things you can talk about here. An idea I've had for some while now is this: what happens after the War of 1812? There are a lot of changes economically, politically, socially that begin to happen in America. You've got, this is the era of good feelings when supposedly the Federalist Party goes away, but the Republicans are divided. Democratic Republicans, National Republicans. There's this idea of a growing national pride in America after this war, and there's this brief moment where it looks like we might go with nationalism and not so much sectionalism. Protective tariffs come the 1816 because of new industries in America are growing, textile industry specifically, and we want to protect that from the English. A second bank comes back. Interchangeable parts are with us, so industry is exploding at this time period. The beginning of the market revolution is happening. Henry Clay's American system, wanting to create a national America with internal improvements. That's your roads and canals, your turnpikes. That led to innovation like the Lake Erie Canal system. The new invention of steam-powered led to steam boats along the canals and rivers. Eventually, towards the end of this, you get the first steam engine train in America. Like I said, it's a rise of nationalism. Even the courts. This is the John Marshall Court. He's very involved in nationalism in many of his decisions. We get the Hudson River School of Art, a very uniquely American-styled art. The Knickerbocker groups, these are the writers. Your Washington Irving, who writes the sketchbook of Jeffrey Crayon Jet, which has a lot of different short stories in it. The most famous is The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. You have James Fenimore Cooper, who writes his Leatherstocking Tales, the most famous of which is The Last of the Mohegans. So a lot of American writers are coming at this time period. There's also, like I said, American art. This is the Romantic period that they copied from Europe. You have the Lowell Factory Girls taking place at this time period. There's a lot of information that can come with an essay like this. A lot of changes economically, social, politically were happening. This is the early 19th century. This would be, perhaps they take a little bit before 1812, I don't know, but I would think it would be no more than, say, 1812 to about 1825. Right around that time period. That would cover Madison's presidency and James Monroe's presidency. You have the Monroe Doctrine in this time period. You also have the Missouri Compromise, happens in 1820. So you can have a moment where you talk about how everything looked good, like we're going to end sectionalism, and then the ugly head of slavery arrives, and the Missouri Compromise comes out because of what's going to happen with the Louisiana Territory. As they're moving west, should slavery follow that? And that's what ends the nationalism, is the Missouri Compromise of 1820. America goes right back into sectionalism, and it begins to fall apart. So again, to me, that sounds like a really good essay to give you. But again, that's just me. The Era of Common Man, Antebellum, 1824, 1860, sometimes is the Age of Jackson, they call it as well. 2002, you had the reform movements. How did they expand democratic ideas? And I throw back in that 2013 growing opposition to slavery, because that also covers this time period. Well, again, you notice I have this little asterisk here. What could they cover here still? I wrote market revolution, American system, which I just talked about in the previous slide. That's all your aftermath of the War of 1812. So everything I just said there, well, they could throw it in this time period as well, because these things overlap. A lot of these things overlap. So as you got the end of nation building, the beginning of the era of common man, perhaps this is where this falls in. Maybe there's a manifest destiny essay or DBQ. America expanding westward. Now, this was a B form DBQ a few years ago, so perhaps not, but maybe it could be an FRQ. Factors leading up to the Civil War, which would be the failure of compromise. The Compromise of 1820, the Missouri Compromise. You have the Compromise Tariff of 1833. That dealt with the nullification crisis in South Carolina, Andrew Jackson versus his vice president, John C. Calhoun. That was terrible. You've got then, of course, the Great Compromise, the Compromise of 1850. Right? All that compromise was happening, trying to keep America from falling apart. But once those leaders began to die out, Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, John C. Calhoun, in the 1850s, there's no more compromises. Of course, this was a B form DBQ a few years ago as well. So again, I don't really think this could be a DBQ, but maybe an FRQ. So you never know. Reconstruction Gilded Age. All right, 2000, there was the success of labor unions in improving working conditions from 1875 to 1900. So they've already done that. The 2007 was on agricultural changes, both through technology and political things. This wanted you to get into the Granger movement, the Populist Party. That's what that particular DBQ had you do, as well as technological advances in farming. And then 2 years ago, Gilded Age monopolies and how they began to run amok, basically, and how were they eventually corralled or taken care of during their Gilded Age. What's still out there? Well, they haven't done one on Reconstruction. I'm just putting that out there. There hasn't been a Reconstruction DBQ. If they did have something like that, it would probably be success versus failure. Right? Reconstructing the South after the Civil War. How successful was it? Well, 3 successes you should know. Those are the 3 amendments, the 13th, the 14th, the 15th Amendment. You end slavery, so that's a success. You give citizenship to everybody, that's a success. And voting rights, well, to all males, white and black. But then failure, well, you didn't give voting rights to women. The South, obviously, they're going to have some problems with this. Eventually, Jim Crow, segregation, black codes, sharecropping, those things are going to emerge. So there's a lot of failures to this. And of course, Reconstruction ends in 1877, what's known as the Compromise of 1877, or sometimes they call it the Krupp Bargain Part 2. The Republican Rutherford B. Hayes did not win the popular vote, but no one won an electoral vote. So it went to the House, but instead of a vote, they create a committee, and mostly dominated by Republicans, and they make a compromise. Allow Rutherford B. Hayes to be president, will end Reconstruction, and give home rule to the South. That's really a failure. So those are some things you could talk about. There's the rise of the KKK. There's scallywags, that great word scallywags, and carpetbaggers. Remember, a carpetbagger is somebody from the North who comes south to help during Reconstruction. A scallywag is a Southern Democrat who switches to the Republican Party to hope to maybe get a job. There's the Freeman's Bureau. There's Andrew Johnson, the only president to not only be impeached but have a trial. So there's a lot of things, again, here you can talk about socially, political, and economic. The Republicans eventually turn more and more towards big business. The radical element dies out, and the conservative element winds up winning. Perhaps there's an essay on party patronage and political bosses, but that, again, is basically up here in 2012. But again, it might come in an FRQ. The Plains Indian Wars comes to an end. Perhaps they give you some sort of an essay on this to ask you, how did this come about? Why did this come about? How does this affect the relationship of Indians? Dawes Severity Acts, assimilation, Carlisle Indian School, where they're forcing children to become good Americans, the various Indian wars, the Sioux Indian Wars, the Cheyenne Wars, all that Plain Indian Wars. Could be in Custer's Last Stand. Again, I don't really think so, but again, that could be a good free response essay. The progressive era to the Great Depression, because basically we just have one DBQ here. The 2003 Great Depression, New Deal and its responses, which kind of scares you in a way. It scares me to think that that's the only essay they've had over the last 15 years for this entire era. Now, there has been a progressive B form that's out there, but that doesn't mean that they might not go back and create some kind of a progressive DBQ. So what you have to do is just think of that time period. 1900 to 1920 is the height of progressivism. This is social progressivism. This is in response to immigrants coming to America, the new immigrants who do not really have an understanding of democracy and how they've been taken advantage of by political bosses and corporations. So they create settlement homes, Jane Addams. They create a lot of social reform through this. There's also political reform. This is what makes progressivism different. It's both a social reform and a political reform. We get the referendum, giving people the right to vote as to what they would like to see as a law. The recall votes. If you put someone in office and you didn't like that, you can have a recall. Also, direct election of senators comes during this time period. The primary elections, again, something else that the progressives give us, trying to curb the power of the political bosses. You've got your three presidents, Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson, your progressive presidents during this time period. Theodore Roosevelt gives you the square deal. That's the 3 C's. Consumer protection, corporation, regulating the corporations, and conservation. You've got Woodrow Wilson believes in the triple wall of privilege. He wants to end the triple wall of privilege. Your monopolies, your trust, your banks. We get the Clayton Antitrust Act, the Underwood Tariff, and of course the Federal Reserve banking system. Progressivism even goes all the way into World War I because Woodrow Wilson is the president there. You can get an essay on women in the suffrage movement, or you can add that into the progressives. World War I could be also part of a progressive essay, or it could be something on its own. The home front, right? You've got, while everyone is trying to be fighting this war, you get, they pass laws, espionage and sedition acts, again, going against your First Amendment right of free speech. The 1920s is also opened up to interpretation. That's a return to normalcy. That's where the Republicans gain control again. You've got Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge, Herbert Hoover. This is when they go back into isolationism. They want to stay out of political affairs. And World War II in the home front has never been done as an essay, or as a DBQ, I should say. You've got a lot of stuff there as well. You've got women going to work. You've got African Americans who are now migrating north into to California. A. Philip Randall, he realizes he's a leader of the black movement at this time period. The Brotherhood of the Sleeping Car Porters is a union he's in charge of. And a lot of African Americans are not given the equal access to jobs. So he threatens FDR with a march on Washington to protest. So FDR passes an executive order that creates the Fair Employment Practice Commission, the FEPC, to say, hey, if you want a government contract and you want to build tanks and planes and battleships, you've got to have fair employment practices. You've got to hire all people, black, white, male, women. All right. You have Japanese Americans are being interned during this time period. You have Korematsu versus the United States, a Supreme Court case that talked about was this fair or not. You've got Mexican Americans. We're importing Mexicans to help with the agriculture system, but then there's also Zoot Suit riots taking place in California. So there's a lot you can talk about here. Americans being forced to conserve like they never did before. Conserve, they couldn't buy food when they want to, can't buy new tires, can't buy new cars, can't buy new dresses. So there's a lot of conserving that's being forced upon, a lot of propaganda. It's taking place. Even comics and cartoon characters go to war to try to get us to conform to this war. While at the same time, there's Jim Crow going on in America. So beginning of the Civil Rights Movement with Double V, Victory Over Europe, Victory at Home. You've also got CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, takes place. Now, the last thing here, the Cold War era, they've had three great DBQs on this. Eisenhower in 2001, Johnson in the Vietnam War in 2008. You've got Richard Nixon just a couple of years ago here, actually 3 years ago, 2011, his domestic and foreign policies. What could they still cover? Well, JFK in the Cold War, possibly, maybe more of an FRQ. I like this one on the rise of the middle class, though. I think this is a really good social type of a DBQ because both parties really help in this. There's a creation of the GI Bill, the growth of the Sun Belt, Levittown's conformity. This is when people are running to the suburbs. This economy in the late 1940s, throughout the 1950s and early 1960s is based on consumption. We are a consumer a society at this point. We are buying all new products. There's new types of cars and refrigerators, and Americans just want to buy. The National Defense Education Act is passed. This helps a lot of schools like MIT, Stanford. Their enrollment goes skyrocketing because everyone wants to get into math and science and that sort of stuff. The military-industrial complex, which created thousands of jobs in this country, a soaring GDP, corporate power, the advent of television, conformity, Interstate Highway Act, right? The baby boom, rock and roll, the pill, a beginning of a sexual revolution. There is so much that we can talk about in that particular that would be an outstanding DBQ. Again, they may not even have that, but that's a good thing to look at. The civil rights movement. There's never been a DBQ on civil rights. 50s and 60s, but we've covered a lot of this in class, and I gave you a DBQ, my own DBQ. I'm probably going to share that with you sometime next week so we can go over that again in class. But there's a lot of things we can talk about in here as well. And a compare contrast. If they wanted to go further into the 20th century, in 2008, they go to Johnson. A few years, 3 years later, they go to Nixon. Here we are 3 years later again. What if they go to a compare contrast of Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan? That's something I think about. Right, Jimmy Carter, because of human rights, detente falls apart. You've got an energy crisis going on. The Iranian hostage crisis is taking place. Camp David Accords, but Carter gets blamed for so much. Then comes Ronald Reagan. He reunites the Cold War. He calls the Soviet Union an evil empire. Out of his mind, he creates this thing called the SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, satellites orbiting the Earth with laser beams. Yes, with laser beams. Of course, don't forget Mikhail Gorbachev, the last president of the Soviet Union. So there's a lot you can actually discuss in that particular essay as well. So those are just some of my rambling thoughts, and this took a little longer, but I wanted to make sure I got that out there. And hopefully at some point, somebody will watch this and maybe study a little bit more than you would have before. I don't know, possibly. But as always, I wish you well come Wednesday for our AP exam. All right, have a good night.